Hey everyone, welcome to Trot and I's talk about what a faithful exile is. I am Dave Peters. I am the Youth and Young Adult Director here at Be Free. Trot, I want to just introduce yourself as well.
I am Dave Trotta. I'm the director of Young Adults.
Yeah, so what we've been doing is a series called The Faithful Exiles for the last 7 weeks. And we just wanted to give you guys, the audience, a chance to see a little bit of what we've been going through and what we've been studying. And so, Trata, why don't you tell us a little bit? Why are we choosing the Faithful Exiles, and what's that all about?
Yeah, this pandemic has given us the opportunity to do this. We in you and I discussing what are some ways we can go with this. We knew that we'd be doing a Zoom call, and we came up with this idea because it was something that could have been challenging and encouraging to us in the midst of our quarantine. This idea of being in exile is not something we're really familiar with, and being in quarantine is not the same thing as being in exile, but there are some similarities. And how do we continue to demonstrate our faith while we're in quarantine was important for us. And that's kind of how this started.
Yeah, and what I like is and just that opportunity to feel like we're disconnected but connected with each other at the same time, which I understand a lot of people are going through or went through and still are with COVID. And but first off, let's just talk about what term we're using. So the faithful exile is how we're defining it is a believer who is placed in a foreign culture. That foreign culture has differing beliefs, and this believer must learn to wrestle with the fact that they are coming from a place that has standards, a way of life, and understandings, and they're placed in another world where this may clash and may be completely incompatible with who they are. And our biggest biblical example of that is literally the exiles. This is seen with, first off, the Babylonian exiles, which are working through the major prophets. And we start that with Jeremiah, but we especially focus on Jeremiah 29 along with a passage in Daniel, and that transitions into the New Testament where we see Jesus and working like that. And so as our responses, we can, these exiles, these Jerusalem exiles who are taken to Babylon could decide to revolt. They could decide to withdraw and hide from the culture, or they could assimilate and they could become just like this culture and completely forget where they come from. But what God calls us to, what God calls the faithful exile to, is a different path, something bigger, something better. And that's where Jeremiah 29 starts. And that's we spent 2 weeks on this one, the Jeremiah 29 passage, which it starts with Jeremiah sending a letter to these exiles, giving them instructions on what they are supposed to be doing. Because right now there's this expectation going on in the Babylonian exiles, the ones who are taken away, is that they are going to escape. They're going to escape in 2 years. It's all going to be over. It's going to be done, and it's just basically a bad vacation. It's 2020 all over again. That it's just kind of over. But to what Jeremiah is saying, what Jeremiah tells them right away to do in his letter is build houses and plant gardens. And the expectation he's telling them there is this isn't just a little blip on the radar. This is something that is much longer. In fact, 70 years longer is the instruction given in this one. And by building houses and planting gardens here, they are looking to do things such as have children and grow up their own fruit and do a lot of different things. And that means flourishing and caring about the city around them. And that's where Jeremiah talks about seek the welfare of the city. This isn't just them, the Israelites doing charity for Babylon. And because if anything, they have nothing. They have nothing to give this culture except themselves. And that's what Jeremiah calls them to give. It says, give yourself to this culture by seeking the welfare, by building them up morally, building them up economically, building them up in justice, calling them out when they're failing to do well, and buying their goods, as interacting, learning their language, learning their education, and all that stuff. And even though this culture, this Babylonian culture, fails to follow God, fails to recognize God, a faithful exile is here to serve God by caring and loving this culture and calling it to something greater. And so that's our first things of faithful exile is we are called to seek the welfare, to build up one another, and not just build up the culture that we come from, meaning our, like for Israel, the Jerusalem culture, but the culture of Babylon and calling them to something greater. So that's kind of the summary of what we talked about in Jeremiah. Trotta, what were your thoughts when we were going through this?
You know, it was interesting looking through Jeremiah the first week because I really felt it connected to our experience going through COVID in that we had no idea how long the quarantine was going to take. You know, at that point, I believe it was in April, and we're still in the quarantine now. We weren't given a specific timetable, but I'm sure many of us expected that this would be something that would happen very quickly. And it was this idea of waiting and being faithful is waiting on God is very important. And obviously for the Israelites, it was 70 years. For us, we're not sure how long this quarantine is going to last, but the principles are the same. We need to prepare as if this is our lives now. We can't be waiting for the future, waiting for something else, because we'll then sacrifice the present. And so this idea of like, what can we do as faithful believers now in the middle of quarantine rather than just waiting for things to end? And I think that Jeremiah passage was an inspiration for that. The other thing I noticed about that was the idea of assimilation, where the Israelites were expected to some level, assimilate into that culture of the Babylonians. And that kind of transitions us to what we did the following week, which was Daniel chapter 1. And in Daniel chapter 1, the Israelites were already exiled, and the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, had chosen particularly skillful and talented youth of the Israelites. It had said in the passage, without blemish, with skill and wisdom. One of these people was a guy by the name of Daniel. And Daniel was immediately hit with an obstacle in Babylon because he was commanded to eat and drink of the king's food which would have been defiling to the Israelites. And so what he did was, instead of revolting or instead of just giving in, he came up with a plan. And his plan was that he went up to the chiefs of the city and said, give us vegetables, give us the food required by our culture, and see if we are any less or more healthy than the people you gave your food to. And if we are less healthy, then we'll eat your food. But if we are more healthy or just as healthy, then it shows that it's okay. And so the chiefs agreed. And what ended up happening was the Israelites ended up being more healthy than they were before. And as a result, because of Daniel's faithfulness and because of Daniel's action, God granted him wisdom and understanding and favor among King Nebuchadnezzar. And it led to a discussion about what it means to be in a God-honoring and effective church within a culture that is, I guess you could say, opposing to that church. We live in a culture that is in opposition to God. And so part of it is not separating ourselves completely from that culture, but honoring God within it. And so one of the things we talked about was God wants doctors, teachers, plumbers, police officers, whatever, who honor him. So we need to excel in our work. We need to excel in the bounds of our culture while also bringing glory to God and what that means today. So did you have, DP, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, like what I really enjoyed about the Daniel 1 passage is just his approach to the whole thing was, as like you said, he could have assimilated, he could have revolted, he could have done a lot of things, but what he does is he meets this culture where it's at and where it's coming from. And he recognizes what this guy has to do, which is feed them, and he wants to feed them with food that's not good for them. And so he meets him and being like, hey, I know you want to feed me and take care of me in the way that you understand, but I understand a way that's better. I don't understand a way that's even greater, and it doesn't lose you anything. And so, a faithful exile coming to a place where we can compromise, or it's not like we're compromising our beliefs, but we're coming to the culture in a way that is approachable, a way that works, or it's a way that builds up both of the parties, not just one. It's like a win-win kind of situation. Um, and that leads us into our next one, which is Daniel 3, which ends up being a win-lose circumstance, meaning that by default, somebody must fail. And where we kind of have approached this study from understanding how the exile and COVID can be related. There's a much deeper thing going on here, which is the COVID isn't the exile. It's not the same as a huge burning of Jerusalem. But there's something deeper that each one of us can learn in our time, not only as people going through COVID-19 situation, but as believers. And that's what's kind of coming up here. In the fiery furnace, this is a super popular story that very quickly Nebuchadnezzar creates a statue, and he wants all people of his culture or to come and bow, which includes these faithful guys called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they must bow down and worship this idol, or they're thrown in the fiery furnace. And so they're put in a place where, or if they bow, they lose. They lose, and they compromise their faith, and they will have to. They'll not worship God then. That's what they're choosing to do. But if they don't, they're going to die. And Nebuchadnezzar is also in a win-lose. He either gets all of his people to bow to him, showing how great he is, because that's his motivation here, is he wants to show his fame, his pride, how powerful he is, his kingdom will last forever. That's what Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do. So if some people don't bow, he loses too. So he has to have a win across the board, and that means Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lose. But if he lets Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go, he loses. So, that's what's happening. And there's another group of scribes who use this as an opportunity to kind of just tattle on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So by tattling and letting the king know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow, they can elevate their position. They can get better. And so people will use their own culture, their own belief systems to get ahead, even at the compromise and even at the harm of a faithful exile who's trying to follow God and be moral and do that. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they give this beautiful line when they're faced with this dilemma that it's like, but if not, but it's like they know that God could deliver them. But even if he doesn't, even if he does not deliver them, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And it's this beautiful thing of showing Nebuchadnezzar a peaceful, like saying, we're not bowing, but we're going to take on the pain, the suffering that's going to happen here. We're not revolting, we're not attacking you, but we're not compromising either. And your justice, what you decide to do with us, is what's gonna happen. And God can save us, but even if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. And we know this story for those of us in Sunday school, that they are saved. But this beautiful thing of being a faithful exile and willing to stand for our beliefs, knowing that on one hand, God can deliver us from whatever circumstance we're going through. But even if he doesn't, that doesn't matter for how we respond, because we will always bring this into a place where we follow God first. And we must recognize the difference of when we need to compromise and when we not. So, Trada, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, the first thing I always think about before we read this story is the VeggieTales one, where they have to bow down to a giant chocolate bunny, and so that's always first in my mind. But it was it's always really inspiring to hear this story of faith and boldness and courage. And what was crazy to me is there could have been a million excuses why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did bow down. They could have made a bunch of excuses and rationalizations, but they didn't. They did not choose to compromise. And that certainly is very inspiring. And part of being a faithful exile is that boldness and that courage to stand up for your faith. But the idea of not giving excuses actually kind of worked with our next passage. We moved to the New Testament. We were in the book of Luke, and at this point, Jesus is just starting his ministry, and he's beginning to gather together his disciples. And in this particular passage, we see that he meets Peter. He's teaching near a lake, and he sees Peter. And at this point, Peter is just a fisherman, and he tells Peter, after a long day of catching no fish, to take the boat out and cast the nets out. And so he goes into Peter's boat, and they go out, and he casts the net. And Peter essentially knows for sure that they're not going to catch any fish because they tried all day, and he's an expert fisherman. But he tells Jesus, "At your word, I will let down my net." And so he lets down the net, and sure enough, there's an abundance of fish. And when Peter sees this, it says in the passage that he falls down at Jesus's knees. And he essentially says, "Depart from me, I am a sinful man." And he makes some sort of statement of faith, which is pretty amazing when you consider the fact that he didn't even really know Jesus. This was the first this is the first interaction between Jesus and Peter in the Bible. And what we see is that part of being a faithful exile is doing something necessarily that you don't think makes sense, doing something that you don't even agree with. But if God is calling you to do a certain thing, that we need to do it, regardless of whether we can rationalize it or not. And the other thing that we talked a lot about during this particular passage is this idea of letting Jesus in to our boats and what that means. Like for Peter, his boat represented his life and his livelihood. That was his profession. He was a fisherman. And Jesus stepped into that. And we kind of talked about what are some of the boats that we need Jesus to step into for us? And how do we encounter Jesus in every single area of our lives? Peter allowed Jesus into the most important area of his life, which was his profession, his livelihood. What are the important areas of our lives where we need Jesus to step into? Our work, our family, our relationships, whatever it may be. And then the other thing we talked about is at the end of the passage, Jesus says to Peter, "From now on, you will not be catching fish, you will be catching men. You will be a fisher of men." And so we talked about this idea of being people catchers and what that means. And as believers, it's our job to be people catchers, to bring Jesus to people. And that in turn will allow them to respond to Jesus. And so we kind of talked about what that means in terms of evangelism and things like that. So it was really cool to get into the New Testament and see our faithful exile theme within that as well. Dave, did you have any thoughts on this Luke passage?
Yeah, just the whole aspect and the beauty of calling here. Jesus calling Peter, and how this relates to the larger theme of how Jeremiah is calling Israel to do step out more into what they have. Like they have this moment of captivity, they have this place, but they're called to more, to seek the welfare and things like that. And same with Jesus and Peter here. Jesus is saying, "Hey, you have your boat, you have your nets, you have your fish. I'm calling you to something more, and I'm using the things in your world, the things that you understand, to show my light and show how powerful I am." And so I just think that's a great theme and a great and kind of place to bring in ourselves. And in our next week that followed, we kind of went back and forth. So what we did was we looked at Daniel 7 and Daniel 9, in which are talking about these certain terms that show up all over the New Testament. And so we wanted to understand what they meant in Daniel 7 and 9 and how that connected to the New Testament as our kind of bridge. And so the two phrases that were really popular was, the first one is the Ancient of Days. This is mentioned in Daniel 7. And the Ancient of Days, in a just kind of definition, is a personification of an ultimate judge. It's this time when that God will judge everything. He will judge all things, good and bad, right and wrong, and make it right. And it's this time period, but a personification of this role of the Ancient of Days. But along that lines is another term called the Son of Man. And the Son of Man is a singular person, a human person, who rules and with all his majesty and all his wisdom acts as both that judge, but is also this human person who rules all the nations. And one of the passages we looked at in connection to this is Mark 14:61 to 62. Where it says, again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And so what Jesus is claiming here is he's claiming to both be the Son of Man, that human and singular person who rules and has absolute majesty of Daniel 7, and the Ancient of Days as the judge who will do all the ruling and decreeing of what is right and what is wrong. And that's a huge claim. And in this passage in Mark 14, this is heresy. If this isn't true, if Jesus is not the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, Jesus is claiming, I am the God who judges. And so the priest would freak out, rightfully so, and bring it to a place of crucifixion. But Jesus, as claiming to be, and the fulfillment of this, as that is true, it's a really powerful claim. And we also looked at Daniel 9, which talks about 6 prophecies that Jesus fulfills, and that Jesus has fit the 6 metrics of how Daniel was measuring the coming of this majestic Son of Man, and Jesus fit all 6 of them. And along with that, Daniel was also giving a model of prayer, which we dived into as a group as well, which is that we are preparing our hearts before we pray. We bring adoration, a respect to God, a confession, and a petition, and then waiting for God. And what this does for a faithful exile is, on one hand, we recognize who Jesus is, the Son of Man, the Ancient of Days, the Son of God, the Son of Man coming in clouds. And on the other side, learning that as we pray, as we bring into our place of prayer, this place of preparation, adoration, confession, and petition, and then waiting, we can learn how to kind of slow things down. Yeah. What's your thoughts?
The 2 things that stood out to me reading these passages, which I was only marginally familiar with, are, first of all, it was awesome to see Jesus foretold in the Old Testament thousands of years before he was even incarnated. And so it was really cool to see those references to the Son of Man and to the Ancient of Days as well. The other thing that stood out to me even more was reading this just a few weeks after the Jeremiah passage, in which God says through Jeremiah that they would have to wait 70 years before being freed from exile. To see God then add much, much longer of a time onto that already was incredible to me. But I think what it showed me is there's this idea that, like, God's timetable is not our timetable. Our job is to be faithful to his timetable, not the other way around. And so God promised that he would free his people from exile. And God doesn't break his promises. So that is going to happen. But it's not going to be on our schedule. It's going to be on his. And so that was kind of just encouraging and challenging to hear that. We then moved into 1 Peter chapter 2. And in this passage, there's a couple things that we highlighted. First of all, it talked about in the beginning this idea of longing for a pure spiritual milk, as newborn infants do. And this does not mean that, Christians are spiritually immature and are like babies. What it's saying is that we have a desire for the word. The same word that is used in craving for pure spiritual milk is a word that's used in Psalms, which says, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you. That is how we have to thirst for the word of God. And so that was certainly challenging for us. But the crux of this passage was talking about how Jesus is both the chief cornerstone and a stumbling rock of offense. And so we kind of looked at what that means. So first of all, the chief cornerstone, what that means is when you think of like a cornerstone on a house, it is the building block for two walls. And Jesus is the chief cornerstone of the church. Jesus is the head of the church. But the other part about it that I think is really cool is that because the chief cornerstone is the foundation of two different walls, what it shows is that that God was bringing in both the Jews and the Gentiles. One wall for the Jews, one wall for the Gentiles, joined together in this one glorious house for God. And the reason why this could be a stumbling block and why Jesus could be a stumbling block and a rock of offense for many Jews is because they were not used to this idea of the Gentiles having equal share with them in God's house. God, could have built a different house for the Gentiles. He could have renovated the original house, but instead he developed an entirely new structure with the Gentiles in it. And what a blessing that is. So now all people can be a part of the family of God, not just the Jews. And then we talked about what this house was and what its purpose was. The passage talks about that we as the church, we as Christians are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a special people. And so there's this idea that God has chosen who would believe in him, that we are a priesthood who has access to God, equal access to God. We're a holy nation because we're under God's authority, and we're his special people of his own possession. And so this idea of like, we are the family of God, we are the church. Jesus is the cornerstone, and he's building this great house, which we're a part of, which we play a role in. And what a blessing that is. So that certainly was really great to see. And there's some connections there because we hadn't talked a lot about in this series, the Israelites and the Jews, and to see the Gentiles brought into the family of God was an awesome thing to see. Dave, what did you see in this passage?
Yeah, I love the connection that this passage kind of brings to our whole series. Is because part of the two verses that are mentioned here are, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles," and that's a really that's our whole theme. That's our whole kind of story here, and how Peter is making that connection between foreigners and exiles and giving them instructions along with everyone else to. And then what he continues is to abstain from sinful desires. So calling us to a place of holiness, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans. Sounds just like Jeremiah of seek the welfare of the city, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And so even if people want to go against us, and that stumbling block that you were mentioning, that Jesus is a stumbling block to those who are in and accepting the life of sin. And even if they accuse us, we are to live in such a way that we are seeking the welfare, we're praying, we're calling for justice, we're calling for righteousness, as we're building up, we're caring for the poor, or that even if they decide to accuse us, they still can't say, these guys don't do anything. And so that's I just find that very encouraging. And Peter's doing this almost 2,000 years ago, who's quoting somebody from hundreds of years ago. And this story just keeps connecting all the way through us as believers. And that story of faithful exiles hasn't changed. So to kind of bring us into conclusion, to wrap us up, we're going to go through what's the one major thing that we really were encouraged or built up through this Faithful Exile series.
Yeah, so the thing which I really noticed, the big theme which stuck out from Jeremiah all the way through, was this idea of active waiting for God. We talk a lot about this idea of waiting for God and trusting in the Lord, and that's very important, but it's not a passive waiting. It's not about being apathetic towards God's plan and then whatever happens, happens. That is not the sort of waiting we're supposed to be doing. Our waiting is active. And what I mean by that is trust and faith is active. We need to actively obey God. We need to actively worship God. We need to be actively in prayer. and aligning our will with his. These are all important things. And so when we wait on God, it's not about being apathetic. It's not about not caring. It's a willing decision on our part. So being a faithful exile is a willing decision. And it's a joyful decision too. We have to take joy in the idea that we are faithful exiles. And that's especially challenging. We don't do it with, a grimace on our face. We do it joyfully because we know what the end is. We know what it's going to lead to. And so that's something that certainly has been a big theme for me and has also been challenging personally to my faith, which is why this series has been such a blessing. Dave, what about you? What has stood out to you in this series?
Yeah, I love the Jeremiah 29 passage, if you can't tell, was been a bit of a special one for me. But how it talks about how we are to build our homes and to make our home here. And as believers, we all know that our home isn't quite here. And Israel knew that Babylon wasn't their home. Jerusalem was their home. And we know that our home isn't quite here, or it's in heaven with the Lord and then whatever the Lord brings next. But that's not the main point. The main point is that we are to treat this as our home. We are to bring God's kingdom now. And we are to plug in, care about the relationships in the world around us, to seek the welfare of a culture who doesn't care about God, who doesn't seek God. And we are called to build into that, to live real lives, to have real children, to have lives and jobs and relationships, and build into this on all levels of society, as citizens, as people who buy and sell, on all these things. But we are to do it in such a way that reveals God, to do it in such a way that shows the glory of God and God's kingdom here and now. And it's one of the big things I think that we can really pull from this Faithful Exiles is that even though we know this isn't quite our home, that's not a reason to escape. That's not a reason to run away. That's not a reason to ignore the world around us. In fact, that's a reason to drive deeper into this culture, to go more into this culture, bring art, music, beauty to it, and make this even though this won't always be the full home, we are still called to build houses and plant our gardens right here. And so, yeah.
Said.
Yeah, so I can say I really enjoyed this series. I really enjoyed going through this. Trotta, I'm assuming you kind of had the same feelings.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a blessing for sure.
Yeah, and so this will wrap up our video here. For the summer of 2020, we plan to do some more outings and hangouts, and we just hope you were built up by this little video and those of you who went through the Faithful Exiles. All right, God bless.
Bye.